It's a great pleasure and a great honor to welcome Celeste Marcus to the show for the third time, remarkably as it is. She is the managing editor of Liberties, and we're talking about her latest essay on Liberties, the journal, titled A Liberal Zion. How are you today, Celeste? Thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be back. Thanks for having me, Chuang. I'm doing well. I'm doing well, all things considered.
Mhm. So you're writing a biography on one Chaim Soutine, if I'm pronouncing him correctly. Who is he, and why are you writing a biography of him?
Um, totally. So very, very different part of my identity and my identity as a writer and as a human being. Very different from the essay that I wrote about. Sort of, actually, the two places that I go to in my head to escape from one another are politics, mostly thinking about Israel, and the world of culture, which is sort of a relief for me. Although often, especially for the Soutine project, politics and culture are really intertwined in an interesting and often disturbing way. Soutine was an artist who lived in Paris between the two world wars. He arrived in Paris in 1913, and he was killed outside of Paris in 1943. Not killed, he died, but he was an indirect casualty of World War II because he had a terrible stomach illness for his whole life and was forced into hiding because he was a Jew living in Paris under occupied Paris. Um, so he couldn't get the treatment that he needed. But between those two wars, he had an incredibly important and fascinating career as an artist. He is in every major modern art museum in the world, but there is no English language biography of him. So I am working on it now.
So when can we expect the book to come out?
Uh, I need to finish writing it by 2025, and I am, thank God, on track to do that. So I think probably sometime the following year.
Mhm.
Thank you for your interest.
All right, I look forward to checking it out. Okay, so let's address the topic of the hour. So your essay, A Liberal Zion, is, I believe, is a follow-up to another long piece that you wrote in the journal, A Wounded Loyalty, of roughly the same subject. And I'm curious to know whether you've received this kind of criticism that goes in the lines of, well, you're happily living in America. Why don't you, worry about setting your own political house in order first before, telling us what to do and who to vote and et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, you mean by Israelis?
Yes, by Israelis.
Um, no, I haven't gotten that criticism from Israelis because I think because Israelis are pretty used to people telling them how they ought to live. I do have like an answer to that criticism. Actually, interestingly, the person who said that to me, he didn't say that I didn't have a right, but I was talking to Michael Walzer, who is, of course, an authority on this subject, and he said that he sometimes feels guilty writing about Israel, and pushing from the left on Israel when he doesn't live there. I have no such guilt for a number of reasons, one of which is because as a Jew, I feel incredibly implicated by Israeli politics, the Israeli ambition, the Israeli aspiration towards liberalism or towards democracy, which I think there are many people who would say that there are many Israelis, not most, but there are many who would say that Israel is not a liberal country and shouldn't be. But they would not say that it is not a democracy. I believe, and this wasn't the subject of the piece, although it will be the subject of a subsequent piece of mine, that there is no such thing as an illiberal democracy, at least not a stable illiberal democracy. I assume that will be a subject we'll return to later. But I believe that, well, not I believe, I do have a responsibility as a Jew to care about and be invested in the integrity of Israeli liberalism and Israeli, by extension, Israeli democracy. So I have no qualms. I mean, the idea that I shouldn't speak about Israel. I've lived there. I speak the language. I probably read Israeli news more than most Israelis do. So, you know, it doesn't, that's not among the criticisms that I receive or worry about.
Right. So, just to mention, I've had Michael Walzer on this show twice, each time discussing one piece that he wrote for Liberties, and he's a gracious presence, and I'm very grateful that, I've got to, talk with him as well as reading his works. Secondly,
Yeah.
From your perspective, and also to address that shirt that you got there, what is going on in the state of Israel?
Just so for people who can see the shirt but cannot read it, it says Demokratia, and it is one of the t-shirts that they give out at the protests that have been going on in Israel. They started January 7th, and they've been held across the country every Saturday evening since then. I think this is it's like week 30 something, I think. Week 30 something. I don't remember what exactly the week is now. Tomorrow night. What is going on in the country? That's such a big question. There are so many ways to answer that question, but what I'll say is that there is a struggle over how a Jewish democracy can fulfill both parts of that identity, both be a state for the Jews and be a democracy. And this has always been an enormous tension within that project since the founding of the state, since before the founding of the state. That aspiration, it's not simple, to put it simply. And it has always been an incredibly fraught question that we have never come to a stabilizing answer for since, for the past 75 years. It'll be 75 years next year. And that's what this struggle is about. Last year, it was 75 years this year. Sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. I think for the occasion, I've actually had a good number of Israelis and American Jewish guests to talk about the momentous occasion. So I'd like to hear your words on it.
On what?
The 75th anniversary of Israel's founding. Sorry, didn't make that clear. Sorry.
Oh, thank God that it exists, and thank God that we are beneficiaries of the backbreaking work that the pioneers did in that land before the founding. And it is an honor and a gift to live in a world in which there is a Jewish state. The anniversary of the 75th year was bittersweet because there has always been this tension about the integrity of a Jewish democracy, the integrity of any religious democracy. Can a religious democracy really be free in a way that a democracy has to be? And it seemed on the eve of the 75th anniversary, and since then, but certainly that day, that maybe the answer to that question was no. And at the same time, for the first time in decades, a liberal presence has resurfaced amongst the Israeli people. I've never seen anything like the protests that have been held every week. We've all wondered what happened to the Israeli left, because it founded the state and it has really disappeared. And I don't think that the protesters are a new version of the old Israeli left. I think that they are an entirely different thing. The Israeli left that founded the country was a socialist left, and these are not socialist protesters. They are liberal protesters. They are fighting for liberalism, and in an age in which liberalism is under attack in liberal and illiberal countries, it is a sight to see. I really do believe that these protesters are significant, not just for Israel and not just for Jews, but for every person who is invested in the fight for liberalism and for democracy, because it's the same fight. And so that, like, it was complicated because on the one hand, it was very upsetting to see the outcome of the election from last year. Upsetting, disappointing, deeply shattering. And at the same time, there came this movement, and it's given a lot of people who are deeply invested in the country hope. I know several people who go every week and have gone every week. People like David Grossman and Moshe Halbertal, who, when he's in the country, but David Grossman, who was the greatest living Israeli writer, goes every single week. I went with him and his wife while I was there in Jerusalem. And it is incredible that even now, that especially now, is when the great liberal mass makes itself heard and seen. Yeah, that's what I have to say in answer to that question.
Okay, wonderful. So to follow up on your point just a few minutes ago about how there's no such thing as a illiberal democracy, so to speak. I'm currently staying in Vienna, and in about 2 weeks, I'm moving to Budapest, Hungary, which is right next door.
Are you moving there? You're
yes.
moving there?
Yes.
To live?
Yes. Right. So
why?
I'm going to school there, and also my family lives there.
Okay. Congratulations on the next chapter of your life.
Thank you. So Hungary is been on the news for the past year because of its prime minister, one Viktor Orban, and I think as liberals we are rightfully concerned about what he's doing to Hungary. Well, one, and two, how he's become a model for the American right and the, I guess, international populist right to emulate. And something that, I should back up a bit and say I grew up in Vietnam, and to me, our conception of democracy does not really contain that liberalism to us. Like, democracy means that the people gets to choose their leaders, and the leader is the one that gets chosen by the majority of its people. And perhaps it may not be a,
that's all it means.
So far, yes, but then again, we're living in a socialist one-party state, the Vietnamese. But nevertheless, I like to ask you to elaborate on your view that there's no such thing as a illiberal democracy, because the way I see it, well, there's Singapore, which is ostensibly a one-party democracy. What Orban is doing to Hungary. And many nascent democracies of, say, what we call the third world, they are not quite liberal, at least when measured.
And not quite democratic.
Yes.
Well, I mean, that answers the question. They're not democratic. So if a democracy, a democratic democracy, a democracy that has integrity as a government for the people and by the people, has to have certain constraints so that it doesn't devolve into sheer populism or devolve into autocracy. So there are countries that hold elections, but the elections aren't real. There are countries that hold elections, but the options are carefully tailored by the government so that the outcome will always be what they expect and what they depend on. Now, I know that the first steps out of any kind of political system that is not a democracy. So towards democracy, it has to start with an illiberal democracy. So you can move from non-democracy to a liberal democracy in order to get to democracy. But you can't move from democracy to a liberal democracy and expect to stay in a democracy with any integrity, a democratic democracy. There has to be certain liberal constraints. So, for example, in Israel, and I'm not going to speak about the specifics of Hungary because I just don't know. I know far more about the Israeli political system than I know about the Hungarian one. Although, I mean, yeah, not although, full stop. In Israel, the structure of the government is it's a coalition government. So since the beginning of the state, the way that it has always worked, even when Mapai, which became Labor, which was the left party, well, left of center party, even when they were in power, and they were in power for a long time, the way that it always worked out was that in order to get a majority coalition, they needed to sit with people who were on the opposite side of the aisle from them, like not literally the aisle, but like on the opposite side of the political spectrum from them. They couldn't get to 61, which is the number you would need of seats in order to be the governing coalition without sitting with people that they didn't agree with. And that was a constraint on even the people who won the governments, who won the elections. So that was like a method for keeping the democracy from devolving into populism. Now, this time, and like usually in every other government, you could have sat with, or they could have sat with people who were far to the left when the left was in power, or when the right was in power. They could have sat with people who were far to the right so that they didn't have to sit with anybody who was on the opposite side from them, but they never did before. So you could have created a government with just people who agreed with you, but they didn't want to be bound by the people who were farthest on their side. They didn't want to be bound by the extremists on their side. It would be like, I mean, this wouldn't, obviously the American system is not like this, but if like Democrats could only win if they sat with communists, they would try not to sit with communists. They would try to sit with people on the center right. So that's the kind of like if America was a coalition government. Benjamin Netanyahu, who won the election last year for the first time in his political career, he had to sit with people who were far to the right, people he'd never wanted to sit with before, the likes of whom he'd never wanted to sit with before. In fact, he's sitting with like the political grandchildren of people who were so far right that they were expelled from the Knesset. They were banned by law. So was he elected democratically? Yes. Was it democratic for him to construct this government rather than sitting with people who were not even, I mean, people who were, they're not even to the left of him, but sitting with people who would have not forced him all the way to the right? No. He had a responsibility, and it was the will of the people to decide. And he didn't do this because he didn't want to have to be in a rotation premiership, which means like he could have sat with people who were really aligned with him politically, but he would have had to switch out of the premiership. So with probably with Benny Gantz or with Yair Lapid, and he didn't want to do that. So instead, he sat with people all the way to the right, and it has forced the country farther to the right than it has ever been before. Does that answer your question?
I'd say so. But I was just getting at the Benjamin Netanyahu and everything. Just to put my cards out there, I just recently left the Netanyahu fan club. Before
A
I
lot of people have.
I do find the guy to be remarkable and experienced in both the military and the government, and I do like reading his biography and everything. Comes from a good family and all. His brother is a war hero, which is plus, and also Abraham Accords. But of course, the fact that he's willing to get in bed with dangerous elements of the Israeli right, that harkens back to, I guess, Maya Kahana or Baruch Goldstein, among others, is quite
Um,
is quite dangerous. And of course, my view is that he's doing it because he's an opportunistic guy, right? He's run out of like new ideas to propel the country forward. Right now, he just wants to be prime minister. I think that's. I wonder what are your thoughts on that?
I think first I just want to say for people who don't know who Baruch Goldstein is,
Oh,
he was a Jewish terrorist who broke into a mosque and murdered tens of people. I'm embarrassed to say I don't remember the exact number of people that he murdered. And one of the leaders of a party that Benjamin Netanyahu is sitting with now, and a person who he has put in charge of the police in Israel, had a photograph of this man hanging in his living room for years. So that is one does not need to exaggerate to be an alarmist. If you are not paying attention, then you are not an alarmist. But if you are paying attention, it is terrifying what Netanyahu has decided to do, what he's been willing to do in order to further his own career. I agree with you. I agree with you that it's pure opportunism. I don't believe, as many people have said, that the reason that he's doing this is because he wants to stay out of jail. I don't think he's going to go to jail. I think the reason that he's doing this is because he cannot imagine a world in which he does not live in Balfour. Balfour is like the Israeli White House. And it's such a strange thing to watch him devolve in this way, because I think a lot of people believed that Netanyahu was the kind of person who didn't lose control. And I think he has lost control. I think that the things that are happening in the country now I don't believe that he's doing them because he wants to, because he had this view of what, like, for example, the constraints that are being placed on the Israeli Supreme Court right now, which is what it has been a focal point of the protests, although people who say that they're what the protests are about really misunderstand the scope of the protests and what the people who are running them, the movement that is propelling them forward, what they are trying to do. It's like the war over the Supreme Court is really a synecdoche for broader trends. But there are people in Likud and Bibi's party, one person in particular, Yariv Levin, who feel that the Supreme Court is a weapon for the left in the country, and they want to muzzle it or cripple it. And Netanyahu is doing this because he needs to, because if he doesn't allow them to do what they want to do, they'll leave his coalition. So he's really not, I mean, he's sitting in the front of the car, but his hand's not on the wheel. Yeah. And it's surprising to me that he would put himself in that position, because if he'd sat with somebody who was like, if he'd sat with somebody like Benny Gantz, he would have had to move out of Balfour. He would have had to be in a rotation government, but he would not be forced to do the things that he's being forced to do now. That's what I think. I mean, this is contested, but that's my analysis.
Okay. For what it's worth, my first impression of Benjamin Netanyahu is that he has the voice of a Bond supervillain, and I still think that's the case.
Totally true.
Nevertheless, I in addition to Liberties, I read like certain other outlets such as Commentary, and I think there's this piece by Elliot Abrams that was
Oh
published in
Lord.
this issue, and
Yeah.
yes, of course, well, what I'm referring to. So the quote that is remarkable to me is when he says, this is the struggle, if you will, between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, between those who go to the beach on Shabbat and those who go to the synagogue. And I wonder what are your thoughts on that particular characterization?
I that piece, I found it so insulting. Here's what I'll say to that. I went to the protests in Jerusalem. I didn't go to the ones in Tel Aviv. And most of the men were wearing kippot and most of the women were wearing skirts. And most of them, the protests begin after sundown on Saturday nights because that's when Shabbat ends. That's my answer to Elliot Abrams. Also, I mean, that's my answer to that. And also, it is infuriating that he would suggest that, and he has, that the Jewish state is only for Orthodox Jews. It's not. And it's insulting that he would insinuate that. Now, socialist Jews built the country. David Ben-Gurion did not keep Shabbat. It's just astonishing to me, the chutzpah that man would have to suggest that secular Jews are not Jewish enough for the Jewish state. He should be ashamed of himself.
Okay, well, right. So I think another fault line that's being suggested in that commentary piece is this divide between Israelis and American Jews. And for the most part, at least from my observation, American Jews are more liberal and more secular, and Israeli Jews are now more to the right, and perhaps that is the source of this certain current conflict. And many outlets like Commentary, and I think another one, Tablet magazine too. They would say that these protests are anti-democratic because the government is democratically elected, and so I mean it's a bad
answer that one.
it's a bad argument, right? Because
it's a bad argument for the reasons that we said earlier, which is that illiberalism and democracy are not compatible with one another. Also, I find it so shocking when American Jews, say that protests are anti-democratic. Protests, nonviolent protests are anti-democratic? What are we talking about? It just is sophistical. I don't think it's supposed to be anything more than that. It's like a thing that they get to say it to one another and laugh, because surely they don't believe that that's a real argument. What does it mean to say that nonviolent protests are anti-democratic? It's like the essence of democracy is to be able to be permitted to do that. And now the police are breaking up the protests and spraying tear gas on them. That's anti-democratic.
Well, so just to keep up the Mrs. Maisel momentum, I like to bring up a name that will probably bring out the 4-letter words from you. I believe Yoram Hazony worked with Benjamin Netanyahu, and as recently as these decades, he's published books that would put him squarely in the post-liberal faction of conservatism. And I think I'm generally sympathetic with some of his arguments, but what I'm not sympathetic to, and this is I would attribute this to many of his cohorts in the post-liberal camp, is his cartoonish characterization of what Enlightenment liberalism means. To be as fair to him as I could, he thinks liberalism means this kind of unlimited autonomy, right? You are free from any sort of attachments that you did not volunteer yourself into. But that is not the kind of liberalism that I find to be, characteristic of American
It's
society.
not liberalism. It's not a kind of liberalism. That's not the way that they define liberalism is so contrived. It has nothing to do with the liberal tradition. I mean, they define liberalism as libertinism, which is remotely the same thing. I mean, I think that they do know that what they're saying is completely wrong, and it just doesn't matter to them. But yes, their definition of liberalism has very little to do with actually existing liberalism.
Mm-hmm. Well, and nevertheless, what Hazony proposes is nationalism, and I think that is the title of his book, right? The Virtue of Nationalism. But therein lies another infuriating thing that I find in the right these days is that they are looking to co-opt the label of nationalism for themselves. To me, nationalism means that a given people has a right to govern themselves. So even if so that's why the Americans fought a revolution, because they didn't want to be ruled by a British man from overseas. And that's why the Israelis led their, heroic Zionist movement, because they didn't want to be ruled by the same British people, incidentally. And I think that should be the same drive towards Palestinian statehood, as contentious as that issue may be. But in your characterization, Yoram Hazony's version of nationalism is not that. So what do you believe it is?
Let's see if it would be useful to quote what he says, because I don't want to. Let me just get it from the essay, if you don't mind, because I don't want to put words in his mouth, and he says what they are. He says what he says what his view of it is, explicitly. So do you mind if I read that instead?
Go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead.
Let's see if I can find it. I don't want to. Yeah, the world is governed best when nations are able to chart their own independent course, cultivating their own traditions and pursuing their own interests without interference. Oh, wait, no, sorry. Ugh, damn. I can't find it. Okay, I'm going to try. Since I can't find it, I'm going to try to be as charitable as I can. He believes that the world works best when like people form governments and govern themselves. People with the same traditions come together and govern themselves. Maybe that was the quote. Let me see. Yeah, it was, but he doesn't say what he means by nation there, so it's not useful. He believes that.
I think I found that for you. The world is governed best, to quote Hazony for you, when nations are able to chart their own independent course, cultivating their own traditions and pursuing their own interests without interference. So that's where. So what?
That's what I read. That I just read that one, and yes, I do. That is his definition of it. He goes. I think that it's not enough, for our purposes, because he doesn't say what he means by nation. But yeah, he's saying. So the thing that is interesting about that definition is that he's not saying that nations have a right to a state. That's not his argument for nationalism. What he's saying is that the world is governed best when like people govern like people. If you aren't saying that a nation has a right to a state, you don't have to worry about Palestinians claiming that they have a right to a state. If Hazoni's definition of nationalism is not right-based, because it's illiberal, and liberalism is the tradition that defends rights, if it's not right-based, then he doesn't care whether or not certain nations do get states and certain ones don't. His argument is simply that this is how the world would be governed best. And he says that he says explicitly in The Virtue of Nationalism that he doesn't believe that, he doesn't care whether or not some nations don't get a state. So he doesn't think that everybody has a right to. He doesn't care about rights. He's not interested in rights.
I believe it was in Herzog. I'm sorry, I was interrupting you.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so Herzog,
It's enough.
Saul Bellow. The Saul Bellow, I think the character Moses Herzog was writing a letter to Nietzsche of all people, and he wrote that anyone who has a political philosophy or an ideology should be concerned about the ways in which future generations may corrupt it. Of course, I'm paraphrasing that. And you've, to quote your essay, Hazoni's cult of lightness grants biggest license to despise, to disenfranchise, and to abuse the inevitable pollutants, the minorities and the immigrants and the asylum seekers, which corrupt his dark ideal. So I guess you're channeling Saul Bellow there. So in what ways can Hazoni's, I guess, homogeneous nationalism corrupt?
If a democracy isn't constrained to protect its minorities, then a majority will abuse them. And if Hazoni advocates for nations that are unconstrained so that they can govern themselves with the intention of enforcing their conceptions of their traditions, minorities will be disenfranchised. If the purpose of the government is simply to make sure that the traditions and the culture of the majority are enforced, which is what Hazoni believes, then minorities will not be protected. And it's not the government's responsibility or anybody else's to defend minority rights. In fact, minority rights are only going to interfere with the purpose of the state as Hazoni understands it. It's not a possibility that such a democracy would be corrupted. It's an inevitability, because it is, in his understanding, the purpose of that government.
Now, I think there's always a dangerous strain of nationalism that exists where it becomes a glorification of what the Germans called the Volksgemeinschaft. And of course, this idea comes from the Germans themselves, where there's the romantic notion of a nation is people, well, plus the land, of course, but it's people mostly, and the people have a destiny, and they should, and the government, so to speak, is a manifestation of the folks' destiny. I think it was Herder, right? That was really
exactly.
And Georges Sorel from France, he's big on the national myths. What are some of the ways in which I guess Israelis in particular, and I suppose Americans too, can avoid this particular temptation?
There have to be norms that are observed, and when they are not observed, it has to be protested, that a government that is democratically elected will not do everything that is legal simply because they can. And this is a problem in the American political system also. Just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should do it. Just because you can, force certain laws to be passed because you have the numbers right now and you know you're not going to have them in 2 years doesn't mean you should force those laws to be passed. It's your legal right. Technically, it's your legal right, but it's not democratic. And in Israel, it was, for example, the norm that you didn't form a coalition government with people who were all on the right and all on the far right, because you were going to observe the norms which protected the integrity of the democracy. Those principles have to be protected. That's what the protesters are doing now. And I hope that it will work. It will only work if the people who are running the protests achieve political power. So we'll see if that happens. But, these are ideals that have to be taught and protected, and there have to be, publications like Liberties in all languages, and there have to be people like yourself who are defending these values internationally, but it's a struggle.
I think to quote the famous conservative Ronald Reagan, I think was it liberty is only a generation away from extinction, and I believe that's true because the liberty that Liberties, the journal, protect and is standing up for is quite unpopular, at least, especially in times of crisis. And it's true to say that Israel is a state that is accustomed to living in crisis, and this crisis of having enemies surrounding its borders. Although the situation is somewhat alleviated with the normalization of relations with certain Arab countries, and I believe soon to be Saudi Arabia, the people of Israel still believes that they are threatened by enemies of surrounding it, and also the Islamic Republic of Iran. So, what would you say to this idea that in order to survive as a state, well, we, the Israelis, have to resort to these tough-minded people like Benjamin Netanyahu and the gentleman, was it Itamar Ben-Gvir, the far-right figure that we are discussing earlier. In order to survive, we've survived 75 years. Don't you want us to survive another 75? I guess that would be my.
What do the two have to do with one another? I mean, there has never been a government that's more dangerous for existentially for Israel than this one. I mean, the army has said that the reservists who are not showing up for duties, like in a security emergency, the shekel has plummeted. Investors have pulled out of the country. The best and the brightest citizens of Israel are leaving en masse because they don't want to be part of an illiberal country. So we've survived 75 years by not doing this. And nobody believes that Itamar Ben-Gvir is the thing standing between Israel and extinction. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, so to contrast Yoram Hazony's counter-Enlightenment nationalism, you mentioned one, Yael Tamir, I hope I pronounced her name correctly, says liberal nationalism, which, to the minds of people both on the left and the right seems like an oxymoron, although, Michael Walzer in his latest book has graciously revived that definition. So, yes, how do you reconcile these two notions, or at least how Yael Tamir
nationalism and liberalism?
Yes.
How do I reconcile them? I mean, look, nationalism is not, there is no government no style of state that is naturally liberal. The same way that there is no human being who is naturally virtuous. You have to be taught, you have to train yourself in order to be virtuous. And a country has to strive towards liberalism. It's impossible to achieve liberalism. We are always only failing at it. It's at best asymptotic. And a nation state is uniquely predisposed away from liberalism. But liberalism has to defend the right of a people for a state. They have to defend a nation's right to statehood. It has to defend a nation's right to statehood because liberalism is in the business of defending rights. So it's always going to be in tension. It is a relationship that must be forced. It must be worked on. Like every kind of project, every kind of worthwhile project, it takes enormous work. And it was always only going to be failing. And it is the duty of a liberal citizen to constantly be pushing her country towards liberalism, because any government is only ever going to be failing at it. And this is also true of the Jewish state. It's true of every state. It's true of America also. But that's not a sign that it doesn't work. It's a sign that it is working if you feel disappointed, if you feel like it hasn't gotten close enough to the ideal that you've envisioned. It's a struggle. It's a worthwhile one. It's a necessary one.
I think another attack on liberalism as an ideology has, well, not just come from these nationalist conservatives, but people who see themselves as communitarians. And I should preface this by saying that it was a theory of justice by John Rawls that put me on the path to rigorously studying political philosophy at the cost of having a social life. But nevertheless, I think upon the publication of a theory of justice, there was a considerable movement of opposition by, I think, people like Alistair McIntyre and Charles Taylor and Michael Sandel. They are grouped upon as communitarians, and they believe that liberalism, with this atomized idea of the individual, severed ties towards the community. And I think the nationalist conservatives have revived that argument to a good extent. So you look like you're eager to have a response, so I give you the floor.
It's just again defining liberalism as a thing that it isn't. Like a liberalism is not an atomizing tradition. Liberalism, in fact, is a tradition that values communities because it values the individual right to establish the community and to nourish it. Liberalism tasks liberals with defending the rights not only of their communities but of other communities, which is like one can only be invested in and intelligently defend the rights of other communities if one has one's own. Often, this kind of vapid cosmopolitanism that the conservatives malign liberalism as being, even though they're completely incompatible. Often that kind of worldview goes hand in hand with a worldview that feels as if it is not responsible to defend the rights of others. And that's because you aren't going to be interested in and bound by the needs of other people if you're not used to living in a community in which you're attuned to the needs of the people that you care about and live close to. So it's just a misconception. And for conservatives, it's a useful misconception to cast liberalism as this kind of, bowling alone vapidity.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess being still identifying myself as a conservative, I should say that there is an important distinction between the conservatives who value liberalism and the neo-Natcons who
Absolutely.
do not.
Well, you're like a walking, talking example of a liberal conservative. So you should be better positioned to rebut, Elliot Abrams than I am.
Oh yeah, I'll do my best when he and I get a chance to meet, I suppose. But
Okay,
I'm
sell tickets.
so I think there is or should be a conservatism, in the American sense, that defends liberalism, and I think the time is right for the conservatives like myself, and I suppose if I'm at the risk of labeling you liberals like yourself and Leon and Michael and everybody, to stand up for the Enlightenment values of classical liberalism, and I'm confident that I'm in good company. Um, Currently, the litmus test to figure out whether you are standing up for liberalism is what are your stance to the current Russian war on Ukraine. And surprisingly enough, there are liberal internationalists and people who are, I guess, neoconservatives are on the same page. But it also makes strange bedfellows amongst progressives and nationalists who are questioning America's role in this current conflict. And
Yeah.
I fear that a year and a half into this war with no clear outcome in sight, America may be experiencing a Ukraine fatigue, and once again, the populace will make it as a elites versus the masses issue. So, how would you persuade this? How would you rebut, so to speak, these counter narratives?
How would I rebut the count? What count?
Counter narratives, the one that says that America shouldn't. Well, there's the realist narrative that says America should not get involved, and also the populist narrative that says, well, this is just an elite versus the masses issue all over again.
I don't even understand that argument. What does that mean? That it's an elite versus the masses issue? What does that have to do with Russia and Ukraine? I mean, it's about defending democracy and liberalism. It's about defending the Ukrainian right to their state and to protecting their state and feeling bound by the struggle towards and for liberal democracy. Has nothing at all to do with elitism. I mean, unless it's, I mean, yeah, I guess I don't take the argument seriously enough to rebut it. I don't, or maybe I just don't understand it. I've never heard it articulated in a way that made any sense to me. It's not elitist to care about people who are unlike you, but who are struggling for and deserve the same rights that you do. I mean, I think that it is shameful that we've done as much as we have in Ukraine and we did nothing in Syria. And I think that I hope we don't ever repeat that mistake again. Yeah.
I think what you're also getting at is this tradition of liberal interventionism that it's placed on life support because of what happened to the Iraq War, and there's this very strange, I guess, pendulum that I find as an outsider watching American foreign policy, is that there are times when Americans are interventionists, so to speak, say from World War II to beyond, and that has created great outcomes, but is also led the country to disaster, say what happened in my own country, Vietnam, and I would say what happened in Iraq. And afterwards, America has just gone full isolationist. We won't have anything to do with the world anymore, and thus neglecting to get involved in places where American involvement is actually needed. So I do believe that despite what the left, the real progressive fringe left, Glenn Greenwald type has to say, and also what the current nationalist conservative right has to say, liberal interventionism should be something that America embrace and, of course, use prudently. And I wonder what are your thoughts on that?
Here, here.
Okay, great.
I agree completely. Yes. Yes. Arm Ukraine. We should have armed the white helmets. Yes. We should not have gotten out of Afghanistan the way that we did. We should not have gotten out at all. The world is devolving increasingly because America is shirking its responsibility internationally. And I certainly hope that there will be a course correction in the near future. Doesn't look like it's going to happen, but I'm glad that, it's great to me that there are people in the government right now who are being as consistent and courageous and principled as they are on Ukraine. And I hope that, we should all pray for those people, whoever they are. We owe them, we owe them the safeguarding of our own conscience.
Speaking of, I do find that it's a blessing that the Ukrainians have President Zelensky as their leader, because as far back in history as I can read, the presidents of modern Ukraine, as in post-Soviet Ukraine, have not been the most reputable. You have your Yanukovych, who's in Russia's pocket, and Poroshenko, I believe. Not much good has been said about him. But nevertheless, you have Zelensky, who just when I think not just America and the West is falling prey to, again, conflict and disillusionment, you have Zelensky reminding us that what liberalism is all about, and I think that's very, very inspiring.
He's a hero. He is the leader that Ukraine needed at exactly the time that they needed him. He was also corrupt before the war, and when the war is over, I hope that they will have a leader who is not corrupt. But he is incredibly brave, and the world is lucky that he is the one running the show.
Very inspiring, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. So to conclude this wonderful chat that we've had so far, Benjamin Franklin, not Netanyahu, said that what should America be, and he said a republic if you can keep it, and certainly hope the Republic of America survives. But I'm referring here to the Benjamin Franklin of Israel, that is David Ben-Gurion. I wonder if he said the same thing, a Jewish democratic state, if you can keep it, when he left office. But say some few words about, I guess, whether a Jewish democratic state can be kept.
God, I pray that it will be, and I am so grateful to the protest leaders and the people who go out every week, and it pains me every week that I am not there with them when I am not there with them. I pray that this turns into a movement that has political teeth, and we're watching with bated breath, and this is not the end. I have not lost hope, but this is a dark period in the history of Israel and the history of the Jewish people. And it is a great test about the capacity of this people to protect liberal values. I'm really very proud of what the liberal Israeli movement has symbolized over the past several months. I find it deeply moving, not just as a Jew, but as a citizen of this world and as a liberal. And I salute them, and I will continue to believe in the future that they portend.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wonderful.
Thank you.
On that note of profundity, thank you, Celeste Marcus, for gracing us with your presence.
It's been a pleasure.